work contracts, from my experience, are sometimes a bit confusing for people.
That understatement alert. I've had 3 jobs and I'm not sure I've understood the contract of one of them, but anyway. It's the Germany Experience, the podcast about life in Germany as seen through the eyes of outsiders. I'm your host, Sean, and follow the podcast on any of the major podcast platforms to get new episodes in your feed every Monday. I also have the Germany Experience YouTube channel, and there I post some of the interviews that I do for this podcast. But that's only some of it. You get all of the content here in this audio feed. I am coming to you this week from a locked down Germany. It's we did pretty well in the beginning. Germany was doing pretty well with the whole handling of the coronavirus thing, but we're not doing so well with that anymore. So the cases are rising. There's new measures in place, and it's starting to get to people. It's starting to get to me. I'll be honest about that. It's starting to, you start questioning, how long is this going to go on? When is it going to stop? But you know what? Let's just hang on a little while longer and hope for the best, and hope that somehow the vaccinations kick into gear and somehow we get to a point where we can start relaxing these measures. But yeah, if it's getting you down, it's not just you. But you know what you'll always have? This podcast. And this week, I have Jana from a platform called Meetra that helps international people start careers in Germany. And we'll be discussing what foreigners should expect from working in Germany. But before we get to that, I want to read you this review I got on my site this week. It's a 5-star review, and it's from someone named Sarah, and it's titled, "Grateful Soon-to-be Ausländer. Thank you, Sean, and all contributors. We're a family of Americans who will soon be making a corporate move to Germany. This podcast was the first we found while preparing to move. Yes! And it's been a gentle and relatable introduction to German culture. We've taken your book recommendations and other media suggestions and have had the true joy and relief of being able to say, we know when someone in our lives has given us German travel and living advice. We'll continue to be listeners. Thank you for your help." Sarah and family, I am so happy that the podcast could help you and your family, even in a small way, before such a big move. And get in touch once you're here. I would love to hear how it's going for you here in Germany. Back in February, I also got this review from someone named Will. It's titled, "A Wonderful Escape from My Mundane Job. Sitting in my job in Ohio and dreaming of going to Europe during the coronavirus, this podcast gives me a nice retreat. Well done." One thing I didn't realize when I started this podcast was how many listeners I would have internationally. I was kind of thinking in my mind that it applied to foreigners here in Germany, but I have a lot of listeners who are either planning to move to Germany or dreaming about moving to Germany, and it's so cool to hear from those people. So thank you, Sarah and Will, for this feedback. It's honestly messages like these that keep me making this podcast. And if you want to review the podcast, you can go to thegermanyexperience.de/rate, and you can rate me. Give me feedback. It's a great way for me to know if I'm doing things right, or if you have issues, you can always leave a scathing review. Up to you. Now, on to my guests for this week. In the next few weeks, I will be putting out a few episodes related to finding and getting jobs in Germany. And this is one of them. My guest is Jana from a platform called Meetra, which helps internationals start their careers in Germany. Jana joins me to discuss some of the myths and incorrect expectations that foreigners have about working in Germany, what they should expect from a German workplace, the German work contract, and some of the differences between working for corporates and startups. Here's Jana. Jana, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about just basically some things around working in Germany and some expectations that foreigners might come. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sean. Really glad to be here today.
Yeah, and let's start by introducing you. What is your background?
I do have a business background. Maybe also to start with, I'm not a foreigner, so I'm from Germany. Yeah, but I'm glad I can, like, I'm allowed to be on your show.
Absolutely. I love having Germans on, actually.
Yeah, I've also seen that or heard that in other episodes.
Yeah.
But I do have a business background, so that's what I studied, and I worked for different corporates here in Germany and also abroad, and then basically in consulting. So that's how I started my career, I would say. So I do have a kind of IT background, IT and HR. That's where I gained a lot of experience. And about 3 years ago, I decided to start my own company because I encountered a lot of gaps in my professional life in terms of recruitment and especially in an international setup. And I think that's also what we'll probably be talking about today.
Yes. Yes, we will. So that's quite interesting because at the moment I'm doing a few episodes around working in Germany and the workplace. So we're covering a lot of ground with regards to that. And one of the things that I discussed on a previous episode with a guest named Ivan, we discussed the misconceptions that some people have about Germany and getting a job in Germany. And he brought up a lot of good points. But I think, do you think that there are myths and expectations in foreigners' minds about working in Germany and what they expect?
Yes, definitely. And I have to say, I think I do encounter them almost on a daily basis in my work.
Really?
I mean, I don't want to sound negative, but
right.
That's, I think, also part of how the whole idea came up, because when I moved abroad, I spent time in India. I also worked in the US for some time, in Taiwan, and so on. I often had these situations where people said, I would love to work in Germany. I've heard there's such a high need, and it's so easy. There are so many jobs available and so on. And I think these are the typical myth, I would say, I encounter quite often. So I think people often think that it's quite easy to find a job, also that there are kind of high salaries, and
yes.
Which, I mean, is the case in some professions, but not everywhere. And also what I often heard is that there's quite a high standard of living, but I think that depends on where you come from, probably.
Yes.
And that everything's efficient. I think that's a kind of stereotype people have on their mind, that Germany is so efficient and just has a high standard everywhere. And unfortunately, I have to say that's not always the case.
It's definitely not the case.
Yeah.
But yes, that is something I have encountered, especially when talking to people from other countries that haven't moved here yet, or people back home in South Africa from where I'm from. And they always talk about the high salaries here. And I'm like, yeah, but in relation to a country like South Africa, for example, the salaries are very good, but so is the cost of living. I mean, some of the food here costs twice as much as what you would pay in South Africa for it or whatever. So there's also, I think, that kind of adjustment that people don't necessarily make in their minds as well. I mean, it's obviously between South Africa and Germany, it's a big gap, but that also factors into it depending on which country they're from.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think people tend to underestimate like social security contributions and tax deductions as well, on top of cost of living in general. I think that I've seen so many cases where people had a kind of, let's say, bad surprise because, I mean, what you sign up for is not what you have on your bank account at the end of the month, right? So there's a big difference, and you cannot avoid that. I mean, you have to pay health insurance and so on. It's mandatory. And I think people often don't take that into account.
That is a very, very good point. And they definitely do not, because I've seen many people get surprised when they see just the tax proportion that you pay. I think it's like 40-something% in Germany, whereas other countries might not be accustomed to paying that much tax every month. And then also, like you said, the additional insurances that you need to get and the health insurance and stuff. It's a lot that comes off your salary in the end.
Exactly. And I think there are great salary calculators, right? So I think that can easily be solved, but it's important to do some research before signing.
Do your research, people. Come on. But what is the reality? So if we are saying, are you saying that it's only specific professions that are hiring, or what is the reality versus that expectation? What do you think?
I mean, first of all, I would say it's only certain professions. So I think people often talk about the skill gap over here, and there definitely is a high need, but of course only for like very certain profiles. For instance, software developers, also IT specialists or engineers who have a very specific expertise. But we don't have like a general need. So you may have a very different profile, which is also great. And I think I do get a lot of candidates who have great experience on their profiles, but it's not a profession where we do have a lack. So the competition is sometimes very high. And that's, I think, where there's a misconception, because people think that, okay, it's easy to get a job. I just have to apply and then it works out somehow. But that's the case for specific professions and also for specific industries. So I often see that when you look at statistics here, it's often medium and small companies that struggle with finding people. And these companies are often based, not in like the big attractive cities, but maybe somewhere in a small town where it's difficult to attract candidates, especially international candidates. So,
And of course, the other factor in that is that a lot of people are either English native speakers or that is their second language who are coming to Germany. So they're also, I think, a misconception that a lot of people have, and I can't remember if you mentioned it at the top here, but they come here thinking it'll be easy to find an English job because there are a lot of international companies. Berlin, for example, is very international. Hamburg is very international. Munich as well. And they have in this mind that it'll be easy to get English jobs. But is that the case? If someone doesn't have German, what are they facing?
Unfortunately, I would say that's not the case. Like I mean, again, it depends. If you are a software developer, it's probably easy. In other professions, it's definitely not the case. And I think, then you may have a profession where there's a really high demand, but without German, it's impossible. Because, I mean, German is still the main spoken language if you move outside of Berlin. And I think that's tough. And it's also tough for the companies, not just the people applying, because that's also gives them a very limited choice. So I have seen companies which are trying to change and which are hiring people who don't speak perfect German. So I think there are still a lot of options, even if you are not fluent. I mean, you don't have to be a native speaker to find a job. But there is a barrier, and it's helpful to speak German. And also, I think even if you find a job where it's fine if you just speak English, the minute you step out of the office, you will probably speak German.
That is the case.
Sometimes.
It is the case. And of course, in the bigger cities, in Berlin and so on, my experience is that, yes, there are a lot of English jobs. So that is correct. But there's also a lot of foreigners in those areas specifically. Right. So you're actually still at somewhat of a disadvantage because there's a high demand for those few English jobs that are there, right. And you're competing against other foreigners. So that also makes it quite tough as well from a language perspective.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. Like here in Berlin is like a special bubble where we have so many people from across the globe, and also these people are well connected. So that's a big competition.
Yeah. Although not to be too much of a downer, I will say when I came to Germany, it was on a wing and a prayer. My wife got a job here and I had to find a job once I was here. And it was a frustrating search at first, but I did find something in English because my German wasn't so great at the time. So it can be done. I think I was lucky. I found a job in Frankfurt, which is also quite, I mean, it's not quite, it's very international there. And I was just fortunate enough to land up in an English job, and I was searching for an English job. So it can happen. We're not saying, but you should adjust your expectations and know what you're getting into, that there's a good chance you're going to struggle for a while before you find something.
Yeah, definitely. But it can happen. I mean, I also know a lot of people who made it.
Yeah, me too.
So it's possible, definitely. Yeah.
Yes. Let's talk about staying with this expectations thing now.
Yes.
What should foreigners expect from a German workplace, from things like what kind of culture they're walking into? What do you think that they should be expecting there?
I think it really depends on the workplace. Like, is it a small company? Is it a big company? Is it a startup? So I think that really varies. what I often hear from people who moved here is that in general, Germany seems to have quite a good work-life balance as compared to other places.
Mm-hmm.
I think we also have a great legal framework which really protects employees, and I think that's in general something people can expect. Although, of course, I mean, if you work for a startup, you also have to expect a higher workload. Or in consulting, like I speak from personal experience, I can say, yeah, you will probably have to work a bit more. It depends. But in general, I think you can expect a good work-life balance. And what I also often see is that, or what's sometimes a bit of a challenge, is that people here in general tend to be a bit direct. So they are very direct processes, a lot of heated conversations. And I think that's sometimes a bit confusing to people. And that's probably not just if you look at the workplace, but just in general, maybe part of the culture. So I often see or hear people telling me that the perception is that it's sometimes a bit less, how do you say that, social, or like less small talk. A bit more distanced. But on the other hand, I would say it's quite effective. So it's people expect you to give direct feedback, and even if you're very junior, you can be part of decision processes. And also, I think people are expected to ask questions, and I think there's a high accountability. So even if you don't have that much experience, if you take over tasks and take care of them, I think you can really have quite a good development. But in general, I would say it varies. Really depends.
It does depend. What you said about high accountability is definitely something that I noticed when I started working as well. It's just, it's a case of you get given a task, and it's just a given that if you have questions, you will ask them the questions, and then, but otherwise you're just getting it done, and you are responsible for getting it done. And that was, in South African culture, at least. I can't comment about US culture because I didn't work for too long in the US, but but the culture there might be more discussions, more figuring it out and whatever. But here you can have the discussions, but you need to initiate them because the onus is on you to get that done, right?
Yeah, and I think that's really like a key difference to many places. Like I've also encountered this, not that much in the US, but for instance, in India, I mean, that's maybe a big culture gap, but we had these cases so often where people say, okay, so this is the deadline we agree on. So it's in 14 days. And then after 14 days, me with my German mindset, I would come back and say, okay, so 14 days. So where's
the stuff?
And then say, oh, but we never talked about that again. Yeah, but we said 14 days.
It is such a good point. And I think I cannot stress what a big culture shock that is for people coming in from other cultures, because it is so true. And what happens is, just as an example, you'll be sitting in a meeting and a point will come up, some topic, and you'll have a comment, and then you'll say something, and then the expectation after you've had a discussion, people will ask you, they won't even necessarily say, will you take care of it? But they will this job will land with you. This task will land with you. And you might not even realize that it's landed with you because in the discussion, that's kind of the way it went. And you leave the meeting and forget the point completely. And like you said, then in 2 weeks' time, someone comes and says, hey, what's happening with that thing? I'm like, I didn't even know it was a thing. I didn't know.
Yeah, that's, and I mean, I think you can also see that in daily life, right? We have like bus plans or whatever, and we expect train or bus to be exactly on time, and then we start getting angry about that. And in work life, it varies a bit, but I would say accountability is definitely really important. And I also often see that on the company side, like with recruiters or people who hire like their first, let's say, internationals, and who don't have that much experience with it, that's sometimes really confusing. And there's sometimes a misconception that, okay, he or she is not a reliable person. Like he's like not really taking care of the task. But I think in reality, it's just a culture gap.
It is. Yeah. In fact, all the companies that I worked in had a good understanding and had a good structure to say, okay, this is your task. It's done by now, and had follow-ups in place. So again, it comes back to what we said earlier. Everything that we're saying now does depend on where you land up, because companies, of course, just because they're German and they maybe have some similar things, they can be very different in Germany as well.
Yeah, I mean, it really, there are also very international companies, right, which have a different setup. I would say that really varies. Yeah, definitely. But it's a big difference. And also one other thing, that's a step back, I don't know, but I think the way you get your job is also very different compared to other places. Like even before you get into the workplace, because we have this recruitment process in place where companies expect a really, really detailed application, and you expect people to be very precise and to really look at the job ad and
a lot of documentation.
Yeah. And I think that's sometimes really frustrating when looking for a job, because it means that it's time intensive. You cannot just send out a general application and then see what you get back. You have to be really precise. And I think this part of being precise is really, also ingrained in our work culture, I would say. And you can see it in recruitment processes. That's the first place where you will realize that.
Yeah, that's also a very good point. When I think back to my early days of looking for a job, it was a case of a lot of work to not only find the positions, but to apply for them. And the amount of documentation you need for a position is something else we spoke about with the previous guest. The Germans need a lot of proof of everything that you've done in your career. So that is also very different to how we used to do things in South Africa.
Yeah, I can imagine that. That's but this also varies. Like if you apply to a startup, I think you will need less proof.
Yes.
Compared to, I don't know, corporates.
Yeah. And we're going to get to the startups versus corporates in just a second, but I want to come back to that work-life balance thing, because I think that is it's something that almost every single foreigner that I speak to mentions, and it's I think in every single country that I know of, America, England, maybe even other European countries, definitely from South Africa. There's a lot more, as you said, protection of the worker. You're also a lot more, I mean, you have things like, what are they called? Cours, I think, where you can, you get a set amount of time that you could take off to go and, what do you call it? Like a retreat or something if you're feeling stressed or whatever. Yeah. And there's a lot of things in place to protect the health and the stress levels of people. And if I get sick, or if I tell my doctor I'm very stressed at work, then he'll say, take a week off and you get krankgeschrieben. So
exactly. Yeah. And you get paid for that, so it's okay.
And you get paid for it. It's not like the other countries where you might not get paid for the time that you're on sick leave. So
and I think that's part of our social security contributions, right? So you may feel that you have a lot of deductions from your salary, but there's a reason for it, because if you fall sick, if you want to take vacation and so on, you are covered. So that's where you get your money back somehow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's talk for a second about the startup and corporates that we've mentioned a few times. So obviously by this, we're meaning corporates are maybe more traditional organizations and startups. Let me ask you first, what do you define a startup as?
That's a difficult question. And I've had a lot of discussions about this with my friends, because I would say the whole term startup is not clearly defined. And here in Germany, and I think that's probably the case in a lot of places, it's more of a mindset and a culture that's associated with it. Formally seen from my point of view, a startup is a young company, and a company which is kind of innovative and is maybe very, let's say, growth driven. So it's looking at scalability somehow. I think that's also what's traditionally what people think of when they think of startups. But we do have startups here in Berlin, which are not that young anymore. So maybe more than 3 years, maybe 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. But they still consider themselves to be a startup, although they have a few hundred employees.
I work for a company that's been around for over 20 years, and they still consider themselves a startup till fairly recently, because they were small, innovative, and they definitely had. I think it's come, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's come to refer more to the culture than anything else. That maybe an age or of the company or what they do. It's more like that culture they're trying to put forward.
Yeah, I think it's really a culture, because, and I think it also attracts people if you market yourself this way. I mean, there are also a lot of corporates in Germany which have these kind of startup innovation hubs, right? Like you have the big automotive companies and other companies which are opening innovation hubs in Berlin mainly. And they send people there for the startup experience. So I think this is really, it's a mindset and a culture, I would say. But it's not necessarily linked to the number of years that the company has existed.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you see as the main differences between a corporate company, when we refer to it like that, and a startup?
I would say definitely the mindset. Like I think startups tend to be much faster and innovative and very flexible in their work environment. They, like in most of the cases, I would say they do have very fast iteration processes where they change. And also, if we look at the whole organizational setup, I think often they are much or the hierarchies are very flat.
Yes.
Not always. It's sometimes also a bit different. Depends on the culture of the persons who run the company. But I would say in general, there tends to be a flat hierarchy, whereas in corporates, we do, I mean, if I look at the traditional German corporates, we do really have hierarchies and also this more formal way of handling things, right? It's just a slower process. You have to go through several rounds of discussion and presentations, and things can take very long. But on the other hand, I would say in corporates, you also tend to have a much better work-life balance. So it's often these places are very, very employee friendly, and they have very good, I would say, benefits in general, because in Germany, we also have this landscape, apart from a great legal framework, we also have this landscape with these labor unions, which are very strong. So you will have a Betriebsrat in place. And that's why you usually have very, very good setups in terms of, the money you earn and like the annual leave you get and stuff. That's probably different in the startup.
Yeah, I worked for my first company was in Germany, was a huge international corporation. So they were actually a Swedish company, and then they had they have a big operation in Germany. And there, the Betriebsrat was involved with everything, like even the amount of overtime that you can work. The management almost couldn't ask us to do anything without going through the union first, the Betriebsrat, to make sure that everything was fine. And if anyone even had the smallest complaint, they would go to the Betriebsrat. So it is definitely very protected in those bigger corporate environments.
It's very protected, and it's almost impossible to fire people. Like and I think that's such a big difference. And I think people are often not aware of that. Even in a smaller company, you are like so well protected as an employee. But in corporates, I've seen these cases like where people, I don't know, do like everything wrong, everything that can possibly go wrong went wrong, and you can still not fire people because they are so protected. So it's like a contract for life. If you you can stay forever if you want.
If you play your cards right and you do just enough, I mean, they could still fire you. There are cases where, like, if you do something really bad, but that's the thing. You actually have to do something really, really bad before you get fired in Germany, in these big companies. So it's very interesting. So it's very safe. But the downside, of course, to the corporate culture, these big corporates, is they're very traditional and quite often very German, if you want to say that.
Yeah, quite often very German. I mean, there are companies which also have expats or like people from other locations. But in general, I would say very German and really, just less flexible. And I personally also started my career in corporates, and I decided that, for me, this is not flexible enough. And I've seen this in many cases, but that's also why I decided at some point to start working for a smaller company, because for me, I just had this feeling that, okay, things are going way too slow and it takes ages until I get to the point where I can take over more responsibility, because there are so many other people who are like more senior and there's a different kind of hierarchy and formalities are different. So for me, I always felt that it's not fast-paced enough. So that's probably the downside. But that, I would say, it depends on personal preferences.
It does. It depends on your personality, because some people are built to be in corporates. The thing about startups is they're generally more international, I found. And of course, again, we're speaking in generalizations. It's not the same across the board, but generally startups tend to be more international. There's more expats that you'll be dealing with. A lot of the language might be in English, actually. But at the same time, like you were saying earlier, there the expectation is that you might work slightly longer hours than you would in other companies. So there's a downside to that. And you've also got to be very flexible in a startup. You might be asked to do not just this role that you're hired for, but maybe 3 or 4 other roles. And you which is fine for some. Others need a clearly defined, structured environment. So it's also about thinking what kind of mindset do you have, what kind of personality you have.
Yeah, and also I think what kind of state you're in probably, because with a startup, I mean, things can also go wrong, right? So yeah, your role may change from one day to the other, which I think is also what makes it attractive, but it depends. Depends on the job that person's like, or how much change they are looking for. But of course, I mean, it can also happen that things go wrong and you end up not having a job anymore. Like I mean, I've seen these cases here in Berlin, and that's I think there are differences.
Yeah, exactly. And there's pluses and minuses. I think also coming back to the English side of things, corporates are good especially if they're international companies, because then you're probably quite assured that they have a big English. They do a lot of business in English. So if your English is your second language or you're an English speaker, then you could maybe make that work. Startups are also very international. So there are options on both sides. It's just finding them first of all, and then figuring out if it suits your personality.
Yeah, definitely.
So lots to think about for foreigners coming to Germany. So let's talk about once the foreigners have decided where they want to be, they're in Germany and they get the job. Something that I think is also difficult for Germans, especially if it's in German, is the contract that they're getting. So I just want to maybe cover this, because I think you've got a lot of expertise around contracts and what's to be expected. So maybe just give me a high-level overview of what is in a Arbeitsvertrag, work contract.
Yeah, in a work contract. Okay, then first the legal disclaimer: I'm not a lawyer.
Yes, neither of us are, and everything we say is just advice. You have to do your own research. So this is just kind of from our experience and our knowledge and so on. But yes,
exactly. But I think there are definitely like a few key points that are important to know. So first of all, I think, as we already said, we have a very employee-friendly legal framework. But work contracts, from my experience, are sometimes a bit confusing for people.
Understatement alert. I've had 3 jobs and I'm not sure I've understood the contract of one of them, but anyway.
Okay, I mean, if that's kind of assuring, even as a German, it's still confusing. Like, even as a German, if you sign a work contract, you will most probably ask a friend first. Or I think in most of the cases, you always ask a friend to read it because it's confusing.
Yeah.
And it's usually such a long document, so many pages, and this weird, very formal language. So, and the confusing part is, and that's also, I think, why it's overwhelming sometimes for foreigners, or very difficult to understand. The confusing part is we don't have this one template or very clear framework of what a work contract looks like. So even for companies, there is no clear standard, and that's right. Yeah. But I think a few key points to look out for. So first of all, we do have a probationary period, and I think that's sometimes confusing for people. So you are not super safe, and you can sign up for a job for the rest of your life in a corporate if you want to, if you make it through the probationary period.
Yes, there is that period you have to get through before you actually get properly hired.
Exactly. And I think this probationary period should not be underestimated. People are serious about that, and it's normal. So it's usually up to 6 months, and within this time frame, your contract can easily be terminated. So I think within 2 weeks notice, which is quite short. Yeah.
Yes. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in my experience a few times, where people come in and they don't make it through the probation period, and not necessarily because they're bad at their job, but because it's just not a fit. And what I will say about the probation period is it works both ways. So at the same time, you don't have a lot of security. It's usually 6 months. I think most often it's 6 months. I don't know if it changes sometimes from company to company, but you have a 6-month probation period where it can be ended pretty quickly, like you said, 2 weeks notice. But it's also from your side. So if you walk into an environment that you go, whoa, what is going on here? I'm not comfortable at all here. You can also, from your side, pull out of the agreement.
Exactly, which I think is quite a good thing, and I've also seen that happen, and that you realize that this is really not a fit, and there are other options to look into. So I think, but it's just important to know that you're not completely safe when you start your job. And also, this is often linked to a review. Like you usually have a review after a few months where you talk about this, and it's sometimes even celebrated. Like, yeah, I made it through this probation period.
We generally bring cake in our company that I'm at now. Yeah. So when someone passes their probation period, that person is responsible for bringing in the cake for everyone.
That's quite nice.
Yeah, it is nice.
Yeah, but that's, I think, definitely important. And then, a few other things like we have work hours. Of course, I think like the standard here is 40 hours per week, but that's always mentioned in your contract. Like in corporates, it can be less, by the way, less than 40 hours a week.
Yeah.
And then there's always this question of, what happens if I work more than 40 hours? And this really varies. Like you will often find like this part saying that, every over hour you do, every additional hour is compensated with your salary and there's no extra payment. Actually, that's not legal.
Oh.
But a lot of companies still do that. So
okay.
We are not always that precise. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my contracts have always been kind of vague when it comes to that. They say that your work time is 40 hours a week, but you could be required to work on occasion outside of these these hours or something. And it's not really concretely defined what's allowed and what's not allowed. But it's and in the beginning, I think with my first contract, I was worried that it's not clearly defined how much overtime could I be asked for and stuff. But it's actually pretty normal that they're just vaguely. I think they're just covering themselves to say, you could be asked to work more or in a different location or something like that. I don't know what's standard.
Yeah, it's often not very precise. And I also have to say, I think like if this is something which is not precise, and I think it's okay to ask, but it's also like a matter of work culture, right? So if me as an employer, if that's like the most important part that the person really wants to know, like, do I have to work 40 hours or 41 hours? Yeah. And that's also confusing. So, but in general, I think it's usually okay, but it's good to know. And then, of course, on top of that, we have this whole aspect of vacation days. Like you already mentioned that, right? There is paid vacation. So I think as per the legal framework, you're entitled to 20 days vacation if you work 5 days a week full time. Yeah. And that's the case. Like that's the legal framework, and often you get more than that. I think in general the standard is more.
In general, I think the standard is around about 28 days.
Yeah.
So in all three companies that I've been in, again, this is only my experience.
Yeah.
It's been 28 days, and then we get gifted the 2 days on Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. We get given those at some point. A mail comes from management saying you're allowed to take off on Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, and it happens every year. So you actually get 30 days, but contractually it's 28 days is what's agreed with us.
Yeah, I think in startups it's sometimes less. Like here, I often see that it's 25 days, but even that, that's quite a lot, I would say. So that's quite good. And that I think for that, it's just important to know, okay, if you work 5 days a week, the minimum you get is 20 days. And for me, that's also kind of an indicator. Like if you get just a basic 20 days, it's probably good to ask, because that's not very much. Like, as you said, the standard is much higher. So 20 days, that would, for me, be an indicator that it's maybe not the best employee-friendly environment.
I think that's a very good point, actually, because I've never heard of it being lower, but I know it's possible. So, if you're getting offered 20 days, that should be an alarm bell somehow.
Yeah, that definitely, I would say. Mm-hmm. And then I think another important part to pay, or two things that are really important to pay attention to, is, of course, salary. And salary, like I often have cases where people negotiate something on top of their salary. So not just a base salary, but maybe some benefits or I don't know, mobility allowance. Or if you start working for a startup, you probably, like, people often go for a lower salary, but then go for some ESOPs or other stuff. Just make sure that it's written down somewhere, because if you just talk about it, it doesn't mean that you get it in the end. So
it has to be in the contract and signed somewhere on some document.
Yeah, we need a signature for everything.
And I think that's also one of the things that's very difficult for foreigners, especially if it's their first job in Germany, is what can you question? What is it? For example, when I'm talking about that amount of time that you work, is 40 hours a week, you might be required to work outside of hours. And then you think, but is that something I should question, or does it look really bad if I question that? Like, so it's also good to have some help in that regards, to someone saying to you, someone you can ask, can I question this? Should I question this? So it's always good, like you were saying, to go to a friend or go to a German that you might know, to just run over the details of what you could ask for, what you could negotiate. Yeah.
Yeah. I also often have this, like I do coach persons who come here and struggle sometimes with their situation, or I help them with finding a job. And that's really an essential part in my coachings, that like if you don't know someone here, it's good to have someone to turn to and ask. And sometimes there are difficult situations, like you may have a restructuring taking place at work or other things. And then it's just really important or helpful to know if that's the standard. Also with reference letters, like when you leave your job, like how to handle that. So there.
And that's something that people also don't mind, is that don't necessarily know, is that when you leave in Germany, it's expected you get some kind of reference letter to take to your next company. It's quite an important thing in Germany.
Yeah, and it's a fully written letter, not just a confirmation. And let me tell you, that's, I think, something which is often confusing for recruiters, because I know in other places, also in the US, I think you often just get a performance evaluation with a scoring or something else, but not like a fully written review.
And when Jana says a fully written review, you will not believe the details that it goes into. When I left a job that I'd been with for 9 years in Germany to move to my next one, the letter must have taken days for them to write, because it listed projects that I did years ago that I'd forgotten about even. And although what I will say is they do ask you for input into your reference letter, or they might ask you for input into your reference letter. So they'll say to you, what were your achievements? What would you like to highlight and everything? But in general, it gets written by your manager, and they take a lot of time to write it. And it's fascinating for me to read as a kind of a memory of everything I've done there. So that is quite something.
You know what? There is it's a language of its own. So you can read between the lines and figure out what the actual performance was. But it may sound very nice and friendly, but it may still be a bad rating.
It's all fascinating. And then these are just, I mean, we could talk for ages and ages about these things, because there's so much that foreigners need to figure out. But I think this was a good discussion around these points that we've had. Yeah. You said that you do coaching, and I guess that's something that you do in the framework of Meetra, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Maybe a few words about Meetra in general. So Meetra is a platform for expats in Germany, or persons who want to move to Germany and need help with starting their careers. So what we do is we research, or we share English job ads, because I know that that's a big hassle if you don't speak German. So we do share English job ads on our job board, and we do provide a lot of information on how to look for jobs, what you have to keep in mind. We do workshops and so on. And we started this because we help German companies here recruit on an international level. And at some point we realized that, okay, there is a high need, and recruiters in Germany also often have a lot of knowledge gaps. So that's where things can go wrong. But if you are aware of these gaps as a candidate, you can make sure that you still make it through the process, right? And that's much easier than trying to change companies. Yes, it is. So that's what we do. So a lot of know about finding jobs.
Yeah, and I will put all the links in the show notes. Jana, thank you so much for coming on and sharing some of your knowledge and insights into all of this with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun having this conversation with you.
Thanks for listening. As always, I'll be back in your feeds next Monday. Music in this episode by my band 10 Cent Janes. Additional music by Ryan Anderson until the end. Stay healthy out there and just hang in until we can start relaxing these lockdown measures. Auf Wiederhören.